The morning sun filtered through the pristine white curtains of the Chen family's colonial home, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors that Margaret had once polished herself. Now, at 67, she sat in the breakfast nook, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold while she watched her son, David, rush through his morning routine. "Mum, did you take your vitamins?" David asked without looking up from his phone, his surgeon's fingers scrolling through what she assumed were patient files or hospital schedules. His voice carried that particular tone she'd grown to recognize, the one that sounded caring to outside ears but felt hollow to her. "Yes, dear," Margaret replied, though she hadn't. The large pills David insisted she take each morning made her feel foggy, and she'd started palming them more often than not. At her age, she reasoned, she knew her own body better than anyone. Sarah, David's wife of 15 years, glided into the kitchen in her yoga attire, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. She kissed David's cheek with practiced affection, and offered Margaret a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Morning, Mom," Sarah said, using the title that had always felt forced coming from her lips. "I've got that book club meeting this afternoon, remember? The one about elder care awareness. I'll be sure to mention how wonderfully you're doing." Margaret nodded, though something about Sarah's tone made her stomach tighten. How wonderfully she was doing. As if she were a project, a success story to be showcased rather than a person living her own life. The house had been her sanctuary once, the place where she'd raised David as a single mother after her husband's death when the boy was 12. She'd worked double shifts as a high school math teacher to afford the mortgage, staying up late to help David with his homework, sacrificing her own social life to ensure he had every opportunity. Now, 2 years after her beloved second husband Robert's passing, she felt like a guest in her own home. "Mrs. Chun, you're so lucky to have such devoted children," their neighbor Mrs. Patterson had said just last week while Margaret tended to her small garden. "David stopping by every day to check on you, and Sarah always talking about how they're taking such good care of you. You raised that boy right." Margaret had smiled and nodded, because what else could she do? Tell Mrs. Patterson that David hadn't actually visited in 3 days, that the checking in happened through terse text messages and brief phone calls that felt more like medical consultations than conversations between mother and son. The truth was more complicated than the picture they painted for the world. After Robert's funeral, when the grief had left her raw and vulnerable, David had suggested she sell her small apartment and move in with them. "For your own good, Mom," he'd said. "We worry about you being alone." It had seemed like a blessing then, a second chance at family life, an opportunity to be close to her son, and maybe, someday, the grandchildren she'd always hoped for. But grandchildren never came. Sarah had cited her career, then her health, then simply changed the subject whenever Margaret gently inquired. And the closeness she'd hoped for with David felt more elusive than ever. He was always working, always busy, always just out of reach. "I should go," David said, pocketing his phone and grabbing his coffee. "Surgery at 7, then rounds. I'll be late tonight." "Again?" Margaret asked, though she immediately regretted the question when she saw David's jaw tighten. "Yes, again. Some of us have responsibilities, Mom. People depending on us." His words stung, and Margaret felt the familiar shame wash over her. She was being selfish, needy. She should be grateful for the roof over her head, for the comfort, for the security dot, but as David kissed her forehead in goodbye, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than affection, Margaret caught something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. It was there for just a moment, gone before she could fully process it, but it left her unsettled. After they left, the house fell into its usual daytime silence. Margaret tried to read, but the words swam on the page. She tried to call her old friend Helen, but remembered that David had mentioned Helen was filling your head with nonsense, and maybe it was better to give her some space. She tried to tend to her garden, but Sarah had hired a landscaping service that came while Margaret was sleeping, leaving her with nothing to do but admire someone else's work. The isolation was subtle but complete. David and Sarah's lives moved around her like water around a stone, never quite touching, never quite including her in anything that mattered. She existed in their periphery, a beloved burden they carried with dutiful resignation. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Margaret first noticed the hushed phone calls that stopped when she entered a room. David would be speaking in low, urgent tones, then suddenly switch to casual conversation about grocery lists or dinner plans when she appeared. Sarah would quickly close her laptop when Margaret offered to bring her tea, claiming she was just browsing, though her expression suggested otherwise. At first, Margaret dismissed these observations as the paranoid imaginings of a lonely old woman. But as the days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There were meetings that happened in whispered conversations, documents that disappeared when she approached, a locked room in the basement that had never been locked before. The perfect family portrait that David and Sarah presented to the world was beginning to crack, and Margaret found herself staring at the fissures, wondering what lay beneath the carefully maintained surface. She had no idea that her curiosity would soon become the most dangerous thing she'd ever experienced, or that the son she'd sacrificed everything to raise was about to sacrifice her in return. The seeds of her nightmare were already planted, growing, in the shadows of the perfect home that had become her prison. The next morning, Margaret found herself alone again at the breakfast table, the china teacup trembling faintly in her hand as she listened to the muffled hum of Sarah's Pilates video playing in the living room. David had left early for the hospital, leaving behind only a rushed note scribbled on a post-it. Back by 10 p.m. Don't forget your meds. She tucked the note into the pocket of her cardigan alongside the peppermint candies she no longer had the taste for. The silence in the house was familiar now, stifling. Margaret had grown used to it pressing in from all sides, like the walls were inching closer with each breath she took. What she hadn't grown used to was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a paranoia, not yet. But something about the rhythm of life in the Chen house had changed in recent weeks subtly, precisely. Things were moved when she wasn't looking. Her spare glasses disappeared from the hallway drawer, then reappeared a day later in her bathroom. Books she'd left open were closed. Conversations still ended abruptly when she entered a room. And always, there was that door. The basement had never held mystery for Margaret. It had once been the boys' playroom, old action figures and plastic dinosaurs tucked beneath couches and in laundry baskets. But now it was always locked. The knob had been replaced with a keypad. David had said it was for storage safety, that he was keeping some expensive medical equipment there. Yet she'd heard soft mechanical clicks, the muted scrape of boxes being dragged across cement, and once, something that sounded almost like sobbing. That morning, after Sarah left for her book club, and the house slipped into stillness. Again, Margaret rose from her seat and wandered down the hallway. Her slippers brushed the cool floor with a hush, her cardigan pocket jingling with the faint sound of hard candies. She paused at the basement door, staring at the glowing keypad, like it might answer her unspoken question. There was a faint hum on the other side, low, electric, constant. She reached out, gently resting her hand on the door as if it might feel warm to the touch. It didn't, but she did. Something was wrong in this house. She could feel it in the air. Ray David looked at her, now not like a son looks at his mother, but like a man weighing a liability, like someone evaluating risk. Margaret turned from the door and stepped into David's study. She hadn't intended to snoop. Truly. But when her hand brushed the edge of the file cabinet and it slid open with surprising ease, a page fluttered out and landed at her feet. A bank document. An account she didn't recognize. She picked it up. Chin Holdings, LLC. Wire transfer $42,000. Date: 2 weeks ago. Recipient: Lotus Medical Group. She frowned. She knew the name. Lotus Medical had been on the news last year, something about malpractice investigations, lawsuits pending. It had nothing to do with David's work at the university hospital. Why was his name on the payment line? She shuffled through the drawer now, each file thicker than the last. Some were financial offshore holdings, medical equipment suppliers she didn't recognize, property deeds to locations that didn't match anything she knew. One building was registered under Chen & Partners Wellness, located in a city hours away. And then came the file marked Mike.Margaret Chen. It wasn't a patient file. It was a plan. There were printed emails between David and someone named Dr. Langford, a psychiatrist at a private facility she'd never heard of. The messages were casual in tone but held an undercurrent of formality, like a deal being made. Her memory lapses are becoming more frequent. I'll send video if needed. We've begun a mild antipsychotic through her vitamins. She hasn't noticed. If the paperwork is ready, I'd prefer to act before Q4. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She sat back, knees weak, staring at the words that didn't make sense, and yet made perfect sense. The pills, the fog, the careful limitation of contact with friends. Sarah's pointed little comments about her confusion. The way David would raise his eyebrows, just slightly every time she asked a question he didn't like. They were making her appear unstable. Preparing something. Act before Q4. What did that mean? She stood, dizzy, and nearly knocked over the lamp on David's desk. The file in her hand shook as if it were made of paper-thin glass. She backed out of the office slowly, her mind racing, with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. That evening she said nothing. Not over dinner, not when Sarah asked about her day, not when David arrived home and pressed another pill into her palm. She nodded, smiled, placed it on her tongue and didn't swallow. Later, in the bathroom, she spat the pill into a tissue and flushed it silently. Back in her room, she retrieved the file she'd slipped beneath her mattress. She opened to the last page. If necessary, consider early commitment. Can justify based on family history and medication non-compliance. She held the woven charm her granddaughter Emma had made her years ago, a knotted red thread with a glass bead in the center. She turned it slowly in her hand as her eyes welled. Emma was in boarding school now, far from all this. Margaret hadn't seen her in 6 months. Her hand trembled, but her spine straightened. They thought she wouldn't notice, that she'd fade, that her silence would be automatic, painless, willing. They were wrong. The next morning, Margaret moved, with a quiet, deliberate calm that came not from peace, but from a deep, gnawing clarity. The sun had barely risen when she tucked the file folder, now stripped down to only the most damning papers, beneath the cushion of the armchair in her room. Her hands moved with practiced care, each motion efficient and noiseless. She didn't trust her memory to carry everything, not after weeks of medication designed to soften the truth. She skipped her tea, skipped breakfast. When Sarah descended the stairs dressed in her tailored blazer and pale blue lipstick, Margaret was already seated in the living room with her knitting untouched in her lap. The charm Emma had made her glinted faintly from her wrist as she twisted the yarn absently around her fingers. "Morning, Mom," Sarah said. She glanced at Margaret's untouched tea. "Forgot your routine today," Margaret smiled. "Just thinking." Sarah offered a rehearsed chuckle and disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret waited. She didn't trust herself to move too fast. Confrontation, she'd learned, was a dance. You didn't begin with a shove. You waited for your moment. You waited for them to look away. When David returned home around lunchtime unannounced, Margaret felt her pulse quicken. He rarely came home during the day. Something was shifting. She saw it in the way he removed his coat slowly, in the way his eyes scanned the living room like he expected someone to be waiting for him. He found her sitting in his study. The folder was on the desk, open carefully. Margaret didn't stand when he entered. She watched him absorb the scene. The documents laid out neatly, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, her hands folded in her lap. He closed the door behind him. "I was looking for a pen," Margaret said, and the drawer just opened. David's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "You shouldn't be in here, Mom." Margaret nodded, as though she agreed. "I didn't think I needed permission in my own home." His voice dropped. "It's not your home." The words struck her. Not because they were loud, but because they were plain. They were said with the kind of certainty that stripped away all illusion. She leaned forward slightly. "Why, David? Why are you doing this?" He sat across from her. Not too close. He laced his fingers together and stared at the papers like they belonged to someone else. "You've been confused lately. Forgetting things. Making strange claims. That's a lie," she said. "And you know it." He shrugged. "The doctors disagree. No doctor has evaluated me. Not properly." David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded page. "Dr. Langford's preliminary evaluation. Based on our observations. Your emotional volatility. Your resistance to treatment." "You mean the pills you gave me without my knowledge?" He didn't flinch. "You've been unstable, paranoid, accusatory. Sarah and I have had to walk on eggshells for months." Margaret's voice dropped. "You're laundering money through a shell company. You're sending payments to clinics that don't appear on your hospital's records. You're preparing commitment papers to make me disappear. You're misreading things you don't understand." "I was a teacher for 30 years, she said. "I know how to follow a paper trail. I know when numbers don't add up." "You're sick, Mom." "I'm awake, David." His expression darkened. "You think I want this? You think this is easy? You need more help than we can provide. Then why not ask for help? Why not tell the truth?" "Because the truth," he said coldly, "is inconvenient. You think this is about money, about hiding you, but it's about survival. My name, my reputation, everything I've built." He stopped himself. "You don't understand the stakes." "No," Margaret whispered. "You don't understand mine." There was silence then, heavy and close. Margaret watched her son's face shift through subtle changes: control, anger, calculation, and briefly, something like regret. But it was gone quickly. He stood. "You're going to rest. And tomorrow we'll have someone come talk to you. Officially. I won't go quietly." "No," he said. "You'll go confused. Just like you've been acting." He left without another word. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in her room with the folder clutched to her chest. Like armor, the glow of the hallway light slicing across her lap like a silent accusation. Her fingers brushed the woven charm again and again, grounding herself. Emma's voice echoed in her memory. "It's lucky, Grandma. You wear it when you need to remember you're strong." She had until morning. She had to do something. At 3:12 a.m., she quietly crept from her room, folder hidden inside a canvas bag. She moved like she used to when Emma was small, when she'd tiptoe into her room to tuck the covers higher without waking her. Down the hallway, into the kitchen, across the polished tile without a sound. She paused outside the basement door. The keypad glowed faintly in the dark. 4 digits. Just 4. She stared at it, heart pounding. David's birthday. She entered it. Nothing. Emma single quotes S birthday. Still nothing. She pressed her palm to the lock and whispered, "What are you hiding, David?" Then she turned and walked back through the kitchen, stopping only to open the drawer where Sarah kept her car keys. She didn't know exactly where she'd go yet. Maybe Helen. Maybe a police station. Maybe nowhere at all. But she would not be in that house tomorrow when Dr. Langford came. She would not be erased. Margaret didn't sleep. She spent the final hours of darkness curled up on the edge of the couch in the living room, listening for footsteps, her fingers twisting and untwisting the strap of her canvas bag. She had rehearsed everything what she'd say if Sarah caught her, how she'd explain herself if pulled over without a license, where she'd go first if she made it out the door. But as the sun began to rise, painting the windows with streaks of muted orange, a strange paralysis came over her. She stood once, walked halfway to the garage, and froze. Something about the silence beyond that door felt more final than she'd expected. She didn't go. Instead, Margaret returned to her bedroom before anyone else was awake. She tucked the canvas bag deep in the back of her closet beneath an old pile of linens and forced herself to lie still until the house came alive. Sarah entered shortly after 7, humming under her breath, perfectly composed in her navy slacks and crisp button-down. "Oh, good," she said, glancing toward Margaret's knitstand. "You remembered your pills today." Margaret followed her gaze and saw the empty water glass beside the bed. Her stomach turned. "I did," she lied, the words catching like dry leaves in her throat. Sarah smiled. "That's progress." The tone, that same patronizing softness Margaret had begun to loathe. A veneer of sweetness stretched over something hard and strategic. Later that afternoon, as Margaret sat quietly in the den attempting to reread an old mystery novel, Sarah passed by and paused. "You've had that book open to the same page all day," she said casually. "Are you following the story all right?" Margaret looked up, startled. "Yes, I've read it before." Sarah nodded, too quickly. "Of course. It's just David and I have noticed some forgetfulness lately. Maybe it's time to consider adjusting your medication again. It could help with the confusion." Margaret's fingers tightened around the book's spine. "I'm not confused." Sarah crouched beside her, voice dropping. "Then why were you wandering around the house last night with your purse and a bag full of old documents?" Margaret blinked. You saw that?" Sarah tilted her head. "You left the keys in the door, Margaret, and the filing cabinet wide open." A wave of heat surged up Margaret's chest. She hadn't. She had double-checked both. "I was cleaning," she said quietly. Sarah smiled, her hand briefly resting on Margaret's knee. "It's all right. We all forget things. That's why David and I are here to keep you safe from yourself." The days that followed began to blend together in a haze of minor indignities. Her favorite cardigan disappeared and reappeared with one sleeve torn. Her reading glasses were moved from their case. The grocery list she'd written vanished from the fridge, replaced with one in Sarah's handwriting that omitted every item Margaret had wanted. Even the clock in her room seemed to tick faster. At breakfast one morning, David set down a laminated sheet on the table. "We've put together a little daily structure for you," he said. "Just something to help you stay on track." Margaret stared down at it. "Wake up at 7 o'clock. Take morning medication with breakfast. Walk for 15 minutes around the yard. Nap at 1 o'clock. Medication again at 2:30. Dinner at 6 o'clock. Lights out by 9 o'clock. Name was written at the top in bold print, like a schedule for a patient. I don't need a routine, she said, carefully folding the paper in half. I need space to live my own life. David's eyes narrowed. We're trying to help you, Mom. You don't seem to be making sound choices lately. You nearly drove away in the middle of the night with no explanation. I never left the house. But you tried to, Sarah said from the sink. And when we brought it up, you didn't remember. That's what concerns us. Margaret stood. No, what concerns you is that I remember too much. David exhaled slowly as though trying to remain calm. You're being irrational again. Look at yourself. I am looking, she said. For the first time in weeks. She left the kitchen, hands trembling, ears burning. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, eyes locked on the worn charm looped around her wrist. Could feel herself slipping not mentally, but in how the world was beginning to regard her. Her words held less weight. Her memories were called into question. Every small act of rebellion was rebranded as instability. That evening, she called Helen. She hadn't spoken to her old friend in over a month. David had discouraged it, saying, Helen indulged her paranoia. The phone rang 4 times before Helen picked up. Margaret? She closed her eyes at the sound. Yes, I need to talk to someone who still believes me. There was a pause. Then Helen's voice, steady and sure. I've always believed you. Margaret released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She told Helen everything. The pills, the locked basement, the financial records, the way they were making her question her own mind. Helen listened without interrupting. I think they're trying to declare me unfit, Margaret whispered. They want to control whatever's left of my name, my money, everything. And they're using my age and grief to do it. There was a pause. Then, I believe you. And you're not alone. But we need to be careful. I'll come tomorrow. Don't come here. Please. They twist it somehow. Just let me call you again. Soon. All right, but Margaret, yes? You're not crazy. Don't let them decide your story. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. Again, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. Margaret awoke to the sound of knocking 3 sharp raps against the front door. It was still early. The house held that strange quiet. It always had before Sarah's first cup of coffee and before David's keys clinked into his white coat pocket. Margaret blinked through the haze of half-sleep and stepped into her slippers, her body stiff from another restless night. From the top of the stairs, she could see Sarah moving toward the door, her voice bright and clipped. You're early. A man's voice low, professional. Just wanted to get a head start on the evaluation. Margaret's pulse quickened. She made her way down the stairs as quietly as she could. When she entered the kitchen, Sarah was already ushering a man in a grey blazer toward the sitting room. Mum, Sarah said with a brittle smile. This is Dr. Langford. He's just here to have a chat. Dr. Langford turned and extended his hand. He had the kind of smile that looked rehearsed. Good morning, Mrs. Chum. I hope I'm not disturbing you too early. Margaret didn't take his hand. What kind of doctor arrives unannounced? Sarah answered for him. David arranged it. He's just concerned. That's all. We all are. Dr. Langford gestured toward the couch. If you don't mind, I'd love to sit and speak privately. No, Margaret said. I'd like a witness present. He chuckled lightly, as though her response were quaint. This is just a wellness evaluation. Nothing formal. Margaret stood her ground. Then you won't mind if I take notes? Doctor. Langford tilted his head, studying her. Of course not. Margaret sat carefully on the armchair across from him and picked up her notebook. The pen felt cold in her hand, but her mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. He began with small questions. What day of the week was it? Who was the current president? Could she recall what she had for breakfast? Margaret answered each with crisp clarity, her voice even. When he asked about the date, she offered not only the day, but the significance. It was the anniversary of the day she'd started teaching at Lincoln High School, back in 1982. Still, he scribbled notes and nodded solemnly, as if the accuracy of her answers only deepened his suspicion. Then came the shift. Have you ever felt like people around you were conspiring against you? Margaret paused. She stared directly at him. Wouldn't you, if your medications were tampered with, and your access to the outside world was slowly cut off? He looked up. That's a serious accusation, and I'm making it seriously. Dr. Langford smiled faintly and wrote something on his notepad. Margaret couldn't see what. Sarah returned to the room carrying a tray with tea and fruit, placing it between them like a peace offering. Margaret didn't touch it. Have you experienced any hallucinations? Langford continued. No, but I've experienced deceit. And how would you describe your mood lately? Alert, Margaret said. Determined. Exhausted. From what? From pretending this is concern when it's clearly containment. A small crease formed between his brows. Mrs. Chen, he said slowly, has anyone ever suggested you might be experiencing a form of delusional disorder? Paranoia, for instance, is not uncommon in older adults, especially following bereavement. Margaret set her pen down. Grief doesn't erase the ability to detect cruelty. He leaned back. Sometimes, what we perceive as cruelty is simply the world trying to protect us. Margaret looked at him with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Protection without consent is just control dressed in sympathy. Silence fell. Langford tapped his pen twice, against the side of his notepad. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That will be all for today. Later that afternoon, Margaret stood by the kitchen window, watching the leaves shift in the wind. She felt a tremor in her chest, not panic, but the weight of being watched, documented, handled. She overheard David's voice from the study later. Low, agitated. She's not playing along. No, she's coherent. Too coherent. We need more than just behavior now. That night, Margaret found a new bottle of pills placed neatly by her nightstand. The label read anti-anxiety, though she'd never been prescribed such a thing. The next morning, Sarah handed her tea with a peculiar gentleness. Your new medication is in there. Dr. Langford's suggestion. Just a low dose to help you stay grounded. Margaret stared into the cup. Rather not, she said. Sarah's smile didn't falter. Then you'll need to be honest with David when he gets home. He's already worried sick. Margaret placed the cup on the counter. Tell him I'm worried too. Sarah's tone cooled. He's trying to save your dignity, Margaret. Don't make it harder than it has to be. That afternoon, the neighbors arrived. Two women Margaret barely knew from down the street, both overly cheerful, holding store-bought banana bread and awkward smiles. We just wanted to drop by, one of them said. Sarah said you've been feeling a little out of sorts. Margaret's stomach turned. Did she? They sat in the living room, making small talk, eyes flitting occasionally to each other like they'd rehearsed their lines. When one of them asked if Margaret remembered their last visit that had never happened, Margaret realized the performance wasn't just for her. It was building a file. A portrait. A future testimony. By the time night fell, Margaret sat at her desk in her room, hands trembling as she tried to write a letter to Helen. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at the charm on her wrist, her breath slowing. There was no more time for hesitation. They were crafting a narrative. She had to craft one of her own. The knock came. just after breakfast. Margaret had just finished sweeping the kitchen floor. Not that it needed sweeping, Sarah had hired a cleaning service weeks ago. But the motion soothed her nerves, gave her hands something to do while her thoughts spiraled like crows in a storm. The knock wasn't casual. It was sharp. Official. She turned from the sink, heart ticking faster. Through the frosted glass, she saw two silhouettes, one broad and stiff, the other thinner, slightly hunched. Uniforms dot when she opened the door. A pair of EMTs stood before her. One carried a clipboard, the other a folded stretcher. "Mrs. Margaret Chen?" the first asked. "Yes. We're here to escort you to St. Augustine Behavioral Health. It's a precautionary evaluation. A 72-hour hold." Margaret's mouth dried. "I didn't request any evaluation." The man checked the paper. "It was initiated by your primary physician and your son. Everything's signed and approved." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sick." Sarah stepped into view behind them. She wore a sweater draped loosely over her yoga set, her face arranged in gentle distress. "This isn't a punishment, Margaret," she said softly. "It's just to ensure your safety. You haven't been well." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. "I'm not going." David appeared behind Sarah, keys dangling from his fingers. "Mum, please don't make this harder. It's temporary. You'll feel better. You need help." "You mean I need to disappear?" Margaret said, her voice trembling. "You want me gone so I stop asking questions." The EMTs shifted. One took a slow step forward. "We can do this cooperatively, Mrs. Chen, or we can ask for assistance." Margaret backed into the hallway, her hand gripping the edge of the stair rail. "This is wrong. You know it's wrong." David exhaled, a sharp, frustrated sound. "Mom, enough. You're paranoid. You think everyone's conspiring against you. That's not normal." She turned to him, eyes shining. "And what's normal about locking your mother away to protect your lies?" The taller EMT moved quickly. Before she could react, he'd taken her arm not roughly, but firmly. "No, no," she shouted, trying to twist free. But they were trained, and she was 67, small and already worn thin. They strapped her arms gently with padded cuffs, speaking in low tones meant to soothe but only igniting more panic. The stretcher rose around her like a cage. "I'm not crazy," she gasped. "I'm not." Sarah touched her arm. "We'll come visit. It's just for your safety." Then came the pinch of the needle. The world blurred. She woke to pale walls and fluorescent light. The hum of machines. The smell of disinfectant and sterile linens. Her cardigan had been replaced with a thin hospital robe, though someone had folded it neatly on the chair beside her. She could see the woven charm, the one her granddaughter Emma had made from bits of string and beads, still looped around the cuff. They hadn't taken that. Not yet. A woman in blue scrubs entered the room, holding a clipboard. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. I'm Nurse Laurie. We're going to be monitoring you for a 72-hour psychiatric observation. You were admitted yesterday." "Against my will," Laurie paused. "You were brought in under a 5150 code. It authorizes emergency psychiatric holds for individuals who may be a danger to themselves or others." Margaret sat up slowly, her joints protesting. "I'm neither." Laurie didn't argue. She took her blood pressure in silence, then left with the same efficiency. Later, a psychiatrist arrived. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s, round glasses, polite but clipped. He asked about her sleep, her appetite, whether she'd experienced delusions, heard voices, or felt suicidal. She answered steadily, refusing to let the fog of sedatives interfere with her clarity. You understand why you're here? He asked. I do, she said. Because my son has something to hide, and I knew enough to threaten that. He scribbled something, unmoved. That sounds like paranoia, Mrs. Chun. And ignoring evidence because of someone's age sounds like neglect. His pen paused. He looked up at her then, truly looked. You'll be given mood stabilizers and light sedatives in the evening, he said. We're here to help. The ward was quiet, but not peaceful. Other patients wandered. The halls like ghosts in mismatched slippers, their eyes hollow or darting. Some muttered to themselves. Others cried out in sudden bursts. The nurses moved calmly, methodically, distributing pills and smiles in equal measure. Margaret kept her head down at mealtimes. She picked at bland food in the corner, resisting the urge to speak to anyone. Her thoughts drifted constantly to Helen, to the documents she'd seen in David's study, to the locked room in the basement. Was it still locked? Had they emptied it by now? Her mind reached, reeled, recalibrated. She had to get out. Not just for herself, but because she knew now, without question, that something truly sinister was unfolding. And they were willing to bury her alive to keep it quiet. On the third evening, she noticed the small woman in the corner watching her. She had salt-streaked hair and kind eyes. A nurse's badge. Maria. Margaret met her gaze. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps. Not of face, but of position. That night, when Maria brought her meds, she paused. Don't take the whole thing, Maria whispered. Just keep them under your tongue. And spit them later. Margaret stared at her. Why? Maria leaned in. Because I believe you. Then she was gone. That night, Margaret lay awake in her cot, the sounds of restless patients around her. The pills pressed under her tongue, untouched by her bloodstream. For the first time in days, her mind was clear. Someone believed her. That was all it took to begin. The first thing Margaret did the next morning was spit the pills into a napkin she'd smuggled from the breakfast tray. She tucked it under her mattress as casually as one might store a secret letter. The fog had lifted from her mind subtly, but unmistakably, and every movement, every observation, felt more alive than it had in weeks. She'd learned quickly not to appear too lucid. That was part of surviving here. The staff expected drowsy eyes, slurred answers, docility. The trick was blending in just enough to stay invisible until the right moment. During group therapy, she sat silently, arms folded over her lap, cardigan, sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal the woven charm. The young facilitator, clearly uncomfortable with aging patients, tried coaxing stories from the group with an upbeat tone that felt like a children's show. When she turned to Margaret, Margaret only offered a quiet, I'm thinking today. Thinking, yes, but more than that. Watching. Learning. The ward, she realized, had its own hierarchy. There were the loud ones, who argued with staff or shouted into corners. They were heavily medicated. There were the silent ones too broken or too drugged to speak. And then there were the floaters. People who moved through the cracks, neither disruptive nor compliant, overlooked by design. She decided to become one of those. Maria, the nurse who had whispered the warning, never said more than a sentence at a time. But Margaret caught the way she lingered a second longer with her, the soft glances that suggested more would come when the time was right. On the third day, Margaret found herself beside a man named Thomas during lunch. He was tall, lean, and always carried a folded crossword puzzle in his pocket, half filled with perfect penmanship. He never initiated conversation, but that afternoon, he leaned slightly toward her. They said I wandered into traffic, he murmured, eyes fixed on his tray. Funny thing is, I don't even own a car. Margaret blinked. And yet here you are. Turns out having power of attorney means my nephew can say just about anything, Thomas said with a dry smile. And if you're old and alone, who's going to question it? She looked at him more closely. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze was steady, intelligent, not dulled by medication. I wasn't wondering either, Margaret said. Then maybe we should start comparing notes. They began meeting near the vending machines in the hallway between rec time and lights out. Always casually. Always with a second excuse. Margaret might ask about the crossword. Thomas might pretend to stretch beside her chair. From him, she learned about the filing systems the staff used outdated paper records for daily updates and medication logs. From her, he learned about David's study, the mysterious documents, and the locked room in the Chen basement. She's not crazy, Thomas later told Maria in a hushed exchange by the supply closet. And if she is, she's the most logically paranoid woman I've ever met. Maria nodded. Something's not right with her paperwork. Her admission notes are vague. They list symptoms, but nothing concrete. No tests. No evaluations before she was brought in. Thomas scratched his chin. They were preparing this for weeks, weren't they? Maria hesitated, then whispered. Months, I think. Margaret's clarity returned more each day. She began jotting things down, discrepancies, observations, names. A nurse who always marked sedated, even when she hadn't taken her meds. A counselor who noted incoherent after a group session where Margaret had said nothing. It was all part of a pattern, a careful paper trail building a lie. She remembered something her late husband Robert used to say. The system's only as clean as the people running it. And here, the people were complicit, some out of indifference. Others, like Maria, out of fear. On her 5th night, Margaret stood at the window of her room, looking out at the parking lot. A single moth bumped against the pane, over and over, as if trying to find a way through. Her hands rested lightly on the windowsill, but her fingers were curled as if holding invisible keys. A memory surfaced. Emma, her granddaughter, once handing her that little woven charm and saying, "This is so you don't forget your magic." Margaret had laughed at the time, but now, in this sterile world where everyone insisted she was broken, that memory pulsed like a lifeline. Maria brought a cup of chamomile tea one evening, then lingered beside the chair. "I think you were right," she whispered. "There's a file, buried in records from a different facility. It's sealed, but I saw David Chen's name on a donation list connected to the board." Margaret turned slowly. "He paid to make. Sure no one looked too closely." Maria nodded. "I don't have time," Margaret said. "He's not just trying to erase me. He's erasing something much bigger. There's a clinic, a network. You need someone outside," Maria said. "Someone who isn't under hospital jurisdiction." "I had a friend," Margaret said. "A retired teacher. Helen. But I don't even know if she'd believe me now." "I'll try to get a call through," Maria said. "But it has to look like a family update. No names." "Then tell her this," Margaret said, voice tightening. "Tell her the tiger never forgets the cage it was kept in." Maria gave a tight smile. "That sounds like you." They slipped the note into a used medication envelope and passed it along with Margaret's untouched dinner tray. From there, Maria would place it in the outbox marked Family Follow-Up, a bin no one checked twice. That night, Margaret lay in bed, her eyes open, tracing the cracks in the ceiling. She knew now the battle wouldn't be won inside these walls, but it could start here. Margaret sat on the edge of her cot, ankles crossed, cardigan sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists. She'd skipped the sedatives again. They'd started giving her orange ones now, smaller, bitter, but she'd learned to fake the swallow, and talk through the side of her mouth. It was astonishing how easy it was to fool people who believed they'd already dismissed you. Across the room, the loudspeaker buzzed out the familiar announcement. Lights out in 10 minutes. The usual murmur of the ward dimmed as patients shuffled back to their rooms under the watchful eyes of the overnight staff. But tonight, Margaret wasn't going to sleep. She had a plan. Maria had passed her a folded slip earlier tucked between paper towels in the cafeteria. 10:20. Second floor laundry room. Safe. It was risky. But then again, so was waking up here in the first place. She waited 5 more minutes, checked the hallway twice, then stepped into the corridor with the confidence of someone invisible. In the world of the discarded elderly, sometimes, invisibility was power. The laundry room was small, industrial, lined with whirring machines and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Maria stood by a utility sink, her long braid pinned up under her standard-issue cap. Margaret paused just inside the doorway. "You came," Maria said softly. "I'm old, not dead," Margaret replied. "What did you find?" Maria turned, the water on just enough to provide a cover for their voices. "Your friend Helen. I found her number in an old contact file under your social history. I called." She answered. Margaret's chest tightened. Did she remember me? "She remembered everything," Maria said with a small smile. She said, "If Margaret Chen says something's wrong, something's damn well wrong. She's already looking into the property records you mentioned." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Thank God." "That's not all," Maria continued. "She's forwarding your story to a lawyer, a civil rights attorney, Eleanor Jessup. Apparently she's helped patients in wrongful commitment cases before." The name rang vaguely familiar. Margaret remembered seeing it in a newspaper once, years ago. A photo of a woman in a navy suit, arms crossed, flanked by 2 elderly clients smiling outside a courthouse. "I never thought I'd need someone like her," Margaret murmured. "No one does," Maria replied. "Until the people we trust put us in cages." Margaret looked around at the pale tiled walls, the detergent bottles stacked neatly beside the dryers. "I want to see the file. The one you said had David's name in it." Maria hesitated. "It's restricted. I need time." "Then take it," Margaret said. "Just don't take too long." The next morning, Margaret returned to the routine like nothing had changed. She smiled politely through breakfast, joined group therapy, nodded along while the counselor encouraged positive reframing. The counselor praised her improvement, marking her as more compliant in her chart. In truth, her mind was sharper than ever. After therapy, Thomas joined her at a bench near the windowed atrium. He leaned in as if discussing the birds. "Outside." She called again. "Your friend Helen," he whispered. "You spoke to her?" Margaret asked, startled. "I asked Maria to let me listen in," he said. "Helen mentioned a property listed in your name without your signature. A rural clinic an hour outside the city. She's tracing the ownership trail. Guess whose name pops up?" Margaret didn't speak. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. "David," Thomas said. "And several other doctors. All donors to a fake research foundation that oversees the clinic." "So that's what the locked files were about," Margaret said, her voice nearly inaudible. "He used my name to mask it all." "And your commitment," Thomas added, "ensures you never testify." That evening the ward received a new patient, a woman in her late 50s with cropped red hair and an anxious gait. She clutched a teddy bear too new to be sentimental and avoided all eye contact. The staff said her name was Denise. Margaret watched her carefully. Later, in the lounge, Denise sat trembling near the vending machine. Margaret approached gently and offered a wrapped mint from her pocket. "First day's always the worst," she said. Denise glanced up. They said I attacked my husband with a lamp. I didn't. He staged it. He said I was hysterical. Margaret nodded. Let me guess. You own property. My name's still on the deed of his parents' house, Denise whispered. He wants to sell it. Margaret pulled a tissue from her cardigan and handed it to her. Then you're not crazy. You're inconvenient. That night, Margaret lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The ward was no longer just a holding pen for the forgotten. It was a containment field for the troublesome. Women like her, like Denise, women who still had ownership, memory, and legal authority. This was bigger than David's ambition. It was a network built on ERASURE. In the morning, Maria brought a coffee with a folded paper towel underneath. She's in, the message read. The lawyer. Next step. Prove duress. Thomas smiled as Margaret handed him the note over their crossword. You've got more allies than you think, he said. Margaret touched her charm bracelet fingers, grazing its tiny threads. For now, she said. That's enough. The next week passed with a strange rhythm, as if Margaret had become both participant and observer in her own life. She played the part they needed her to play, polite, docile, improving while her mind churned like the sea beneath a frozen lake. Maria slipped her notes and updates wherever she could, inside crossword puzzles, beneath margarine tubs on lunch trays, once even tucked into the sleeve of Margaret's freshly folded gown. Each message brought new evidence, more pieces to a puzzle she had never wanted to solve, but now couldn't turn away from. Helen, her old friend, was digging. Apparently, the more she unearthed, the deeper the rot went. A shell corporation in. Margaret's name had been used to purchase 3 clinics, all registered as low-cost community wellness centers. One of them operated with expired licenses. The other 2 shared mailing addresses with companies already under investigation for insurance fraud. But what chilled Margaret most was the paper Maria handed her that morning, slid discreetly beneath her napkin. David filed a power of attorney 5 months ago. Claims you were in early cognitive decline. You signed it, apparently. Margaret stared at the note, her spoon frozen in midair. I never signed anything, she whispered. Maria only nodded, her face grim. Then someone forged it. Later that day, Margaret found herself walking in slow circles around the small courtyard, gravel crunching beneath her orthopedic shoes. Thomas joined her, careful to maintain the casual posture of 2 bored retirees. His cane tapped a steady rhythm beside her. You're not the only one, he murmured, voice low. There's a man in Ward B, Oscar. His son had him committed after he refused to sell a piece of ancestral land. Called it dementia. Margaret tightened her arms around her cardigan. How many of us are here because we became inconvenient? Too many, Thomas said. But they didn't count on you. I wasn't counting on me either, she replied quietly. But here we are. That evening, Maria snuck them into the records room. She had 20 minutes during a shift change. Thomas stood watch near the door while Margaret rifled through the files under Maria's guidance. The folder marked Chun. Margaret was thin, far thinner than she expected for someone supposedly descending into psychosis. Inside was a perfunctory psychiatric evaluation written in cold, clinical language. Patient exhibits paranoia, cognitive confusion, and emotional volatility consistent with early-stage dementia with psychotic features. Lies, Margaret whispered, turning the page. Keep reading, Maria said. Look at the intake form. At the bottom of the form, next to next of kin and emergency contact, was David's signature. Patient's son reports long-standing cognitive issues. Requests private admission under surveillance protocol. There was no counter-signature from Margaret. No legal record of consent. Just David's note, and a scanned copy of a scribbled signature that was almost hers. They photocopied your old signature from a birthday card, Maria said. I compared it to the file. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest. Her son had used her handwriting to disappear her. The next morning brought new hope. Helen had managed to get in touch with Eleanor Jessup, the lawyer Maria mentioned. Eleanor had already filed a petition to request Margaret's full medical records and initiate a third-party assessment of her mental state. It would take time. David's influence in the hospital network could delay the process, but Eleanor was persistent and well-connected. We're not waiting for miracles, Thomas said. We're building a case, not just for me, Margaret added. For Denise, for Oscar, for everyone they've buried under the guise of care. 2 days later, Margaret found herself in the nurse's lounge. Maria had invited her in, under the pretense of helping with folded towels. Inside, the small TV mounted in the corner was on mute, but Margaret saw a familiar name scrolling across the news ticker. Dr. David Chun under preliminary review in fraud investigation tied to 3 wellness centers. Her knees nearly gave out. Maria steadied her gently. Someone leaked it, she said. Helen thinks a journalist friend jumped the gun. But it's public now. It didn't mean safety, not yet. But it meant scrutiny. It meant David couldn't operate in the dark anymore. Margaret stared at the screen. Not long ago, she would have wept from shame. Now, her tears were different. Not broken. Not bitter. They were born of defiance. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, her fingers wrapped tightly around the woven charm bracelet her granddaughter had once made. The little girl's gift, a loop of thread and beads, delicate, frayed, but unbroken. She remembered her granddaughter's tiny voice. Now you'll always have me, even if I'm not there. Even in here, Margaret had something they couldn't touch. Her memory. Her truth. Her will. She sat up, walked quietly to the desk in the corner of her room, and began writing. Not notes this time. Not strategy. Her story. From the beginning. If the system wouldn't hear her, the world would. Margaret hadn't written that much in years. Her hand trembled by the 4th page, but she kept going. The pen gripped tightly between fingers stiff with age and ache. She didn't worry about structure or eloquence, only honesty. She wrote everything. The feeling of the pills on her tongue. The way the basement door clicked shut when she passed. David's cold voice. Sarah's practiced smile. The precise moment she stopped trusting her own memories. By dawn, she had 23 pages of dense, slanted script. It was messy. It was raw. It was her. Maria found her still awake during the morning rounds. You've been up all night, Maria whispered, closing the door behind her. You okay? Margaret held up the notebook. I needed to remember. Every part. Maria took it gently, her fingers brushing the frayed charm on Margaret's wrist. We'll keep it safe. Later that day, Helen managed to get through on the secure line Maria had rigged behind the records room filing cabinet. The connection was faint, but Helen's voice was unmistakably determined. Margaret, we've got more, she said. It's worse than we thought. David didn't just use your name to buy clinics. He's been submitting fake insurance claims under your medical ID. Dozens of them. Margaret closed her eyes. Her own identity used as a ledger line in a long string of lies. Can we prove it? She asked. Yes, we're compiling it all for the hearing. Eleanor's already submitted a motion to include the insurance fraud in your release petition. And what about the clinics? They're being raided tomorrow, Helen said. FBI's involved now. You just need to hold on. Hold on. 2 words that suddenly felt like a lifeline. Thomas visited her room that afternoon. He wasn't smiling like usual. His hand trembled on the head of his cane. I think they know something's happening, he said quietly. Oscar's been moved. They say, for observation. But he wasn't unstable. They're watching who we talk to. Margaret glanced toward the hallway. They're tightening the screws, she said. Thomas nodded. But pressure cuts both ways. We're close. That scares them. Good, Margaret said, voice steadier than she felt. Let them be scared. That evening, Maria knocked once on her door and entered quickly. They bumped your evaluation hearing up to tomorrow, she said, eyes wide. That's not normal procedure. David might be trying to declare you permanently unfit before anything gets to court. Margaret's pulse spiked. But the evidence, it's not officially entered yet. It's in Eleanor's hands. We need to stall, just for a day. I'll go to that hearing, Margaret said. But not quietly. That night, Margaret dressed carefully. There wasn't much to choose from, but she wore the cardigan with the deepest pockets filled with tissues, a candy or two, and her folded notebook pages. She tucked her charm bracelet inside her sleeve, close to the pulse in her wrist. Every piece of her story, however small, came with her. Sleep came in pieces. When it did, it came thick with dreams of her son as a boy, of Robert laughing in the garden, of Sarah smiling a little too wide, a little too long. She woke before dawn and sat quietly at her desk, waiting. The hearing was held in the administrative wing, in a room that looked like it hadn't seen a window in years. A worn-out clock ticked against faded grey wallpaper. A long rectangular table stretched between her and the facility psychiatrist, who wore the disinterested expression of someone certain of the outcome. David was seated across from her, tailored suit and polished shoes, his mask of control fully intact. He didn't look at her. Margaret didn't look away. The director cleared his throat. We're here to assess the mental competence of Ms. Margaret Chen. Dr. Chen has submitted statements, citing erratic behavior and declining memory consistent with early-stage dementia. I'd like to speak, Margaret said. The psychiatrist blinked. We'll allow time for your statement after. No, she said, louder. I'm speaking now. David leaned forward. Mother, please. Don't you call me that, she snapped. The room went still. Margaret stood slowly, her hand braced on the back of the chair. She pulled out her notebook and set it gently on the table. This is what I remember. Every word written by me. Not typed, not dictated, me. Miss Chen, the psychiatrist began. This isn't. You will listen, Margaret said, voice trembling but steady. Because I listened. For years. While my son used my name, my home, my grief, to cover up crimes. David shifted uncomfortably. He called it caregiving. But I was not cared for. I was medicated, isolated, gaslit, my conversations monitored, my memory questioned. She opened the notebook, flipping to the page where Maria had slipped a copy of the forged signature. This is not mine, you know it. And if you let this hearing move forward without that fact acknowledged, you're not assessing my mind, you're covering for his crimes. The director stared, blinking. The psychiatrist sat back. David stood. She's hallucinating. This is exactly the kind of behavior that... Sit down, the director said sharply. David froze. Margaret met his eyes at last. I raised you with everything I had. I taught you that power was not a license to erase people. You learned the opposite. And now you will answer for it. Outside the room, Maria waited with a small nod and a clipboard tucked under her arm. No smile, just presence. I think they heard you, she said quietly. I hope they listen, Margaret replied. The hearing had ended in tense silence, but Margaret felt something shift. It wasn't freedom yet. The locked doors still remained. The stale institutional air still clung to her skin. But in the eyes of the director, Just for a flicker, she'd seen uncertainty. And in David's stiff retreat, she'd seen fear. The kind of fear only the truth can sow. Maria met her in the hallway afterward. They didn't speak until they reached the edge of the courtyard, where a small patch of grass bent under the weight of late autumn. Margaret sat on the cold bench, her hands folded over her notebook. Maria stood beside her, scanning the windows. "You did it," she said finally. "They're shaken." Margaret looked down at her charm bracelet. "It's not enough." "Not yet." Maria knelt beside her. "Then we make it enough." The plan came together in whispers and coded notes passed during medication rounds. Helen worked around the clock from the outside, sending scanned copies of every fraudulent document she uncovered to Eleanor, the civil rights attorney now championing Margaret's case. Thomas, though weakened by years of institutional sedatives, remained razor-sharp in strategy. "You don't fight a system from inside the rules it wrote to trap you," he muttered one evening, helping Margaret memorize key parts of her testimony. "You flood it with contradiction until it crumbles under its own weight." Maria pulled strings she hadn't dared to touch before siphoning security footage, photocopying staff logs, confirming dates David had signed off on Margaret's medications from afar. "Illegal," she said one night, handing Margaret a folder stuffed with timestamps and falsified doctor notes. "But moral. Funny how those don't always align," Margaret murmured, thumbing through the copies. But they had to move fast. David was trying to push through a permanent guardianship order. One more court ruling, and Margaret would be sealed away behind clinical language. Delusional, paranoid, non-compliant. They had one shot. The real court date was set for Thursday. They had 4 days. The days blurred. Maria risked her job every hour she stayed in the loop. She left a burner phone with Margaret during night shifts, tucked into the lining of a spare cardigan in her laundry bin. Margaret whispered brief updates to Helen, who filtered them into legal reports and affidavits. Evenings were spent in Thomas's room, the two of them hunched over a chessboard with their notes wedged beneath it. "If this works," he said, "you'll not only walk free, you'll take down the entire rotten scaffold holding this place up." Margaret glanced toward the hallway. "And if it doesn't, then they'll regret not silencing you when they had the chance," Thomas said. "Because someone always listens eventually, even if it takes longer than it should." By Wednesday, Maria confirmed the unthinkable. 2 other patients had similar financial trails leading back to David's clinics. One, an elderly widow who hadn't spoken more than 3 words in weeks, had supposedly signed off on a $75,000 loan used to purchase medical equipment. The other had a listed diagnosis on her insurance forms that didn't match anything in her chart. "They've been doing this for years," Maria whispered, stunned. "Your case is just the one they got sloppy with." Margaret swallowed hard. "So if we expose it, we're not just saving me." "No," Maria said. "You'll be saving dozens, maybe more." That night, it rained. Margaret sat on her bed, cardigan wrapped tight, the charm on her wrist cool against her skin. She stared at the soft yellow light buzzing overhead and thought of Robert. He used to hum when he cooked, tuneless, often off-key, but comforting. After he died, silence had filled the house like fog. She missed his noise, his warmth. And yet, here she was alive, aware, unbroken in a place designed to erase people. She didn't feel heroic. She felt exhausted. But beneath that, she felt something deeper. Ready. Thursday came in with a chill. Maria helped her dress. The good cardigan, the one with the candy wrappers she'd never bothered to throw out. Thomas was wheeled into the facility's side room just after sunrise. His presence wasn't officially approved, he was still under evaluation. But Maria had forged the clearance papers. "He'll speak if you get cut off," she said. He's got everything memorized. Margaret gave a single nod as she approached the transport van bound for the downtown courthouse. 2 orderlies flanked her. She stepped inside without flinching. This time, it was her choosing the path ahead. The courtroom was brighter than she remembered. Eleanor was already there, documents stacked neatly before her. Helen sat 2 rows behind with a USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. David entered late. Margaret watched his jaw twitch as he scanned the room and saw Maria seated in the witness area. He knew. He was cornered. The judge entered. The bailiff called the room to order. The hearing began, and Margaret stood. No pills, no restraints, no fog clouding her voice. Just a woman with a woven charm on her wrist, a heart full of names that deserved better, and the truth on her tongue. Margaret stood before the judge in courtroom 4B, her knees stiff from weeks in the facility, but her voice clear. It was the first time in months that she felt seen, not as a file, a diagnosis, or a fragile burden, but as a person. A woman who had lived, endured, and remembered every detail others hoped she'd forget. I was placed under psychiatric hold without a legitimate evaluation, she began, clutching the edge of the podium to steady her hands. Not because I posed a danger to anyone, but because I asked too many questions. Across the room, David sat next to his attorney. He didn't meet her eyes. Margaret saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his lawyer leaned in now and then, whispering through clenched teeth. That same lawyer had filed to extend her involuntary stay just last week, citing her deteriorating mental clarity and delusional allegations. But now those delusions were in evidence folders. Eleanor rose, calling her first witness. Nurse Maria. Maria approached with steady steps and a straight spine. When asked if she believed Margaret was of sound mind, her voice didn't waver. I do. I have observed her for weeks. Her clarity, her memory, her behavior, none of it matched the notes provided by her son or his associates. What concerned me were the irregularities in her documentation, the inconsistencies in medication logs, and the fact that staff were instructed to treat her as dangerous before they ever met her. The judge frowned. You're saying the psychiatric evaluation was manipulated? I'm saying it was orchestrated, Maria said. I'm willing to provide signed statements and internal memos. Margaret dared a glance at David. His skin had gone pale. Next came Helen, holding the USB drive as if it were a weapon. And in many ways, it was. She testified about the fraudulent property deeds, the illicit funds filtered through shell companies connected to David's name, and the chilling truth behind his medical side business. Illegal clinics, insurance fraud, and possible trafficking. The only reason Margaret discovered any of this, Helen concluded, was because she still remembered how to read spreadsheets better than most accountants. Her memory was sharp enough to uncover what no one else saw or wanted to see. David's attorney objected. Conjecture. Irrelevant. Overruled, said the judge. Then Thomas was wheeled in pale, frail, but with his file in hand. His voice rasped from disuse, but his words carried weight. I was a corporate lawyer. 22 years. I've reviewed her documentation. I've spoken with her. There's no delusion in her story, only the unfortunate clarity of truth. He raised a trembling hand. We are not patients. We are victims of silence. By midday, the courtroom had shifted. David's legal team faltered. Every piece of testimony layered over the last, building a scaffolding. Margaret had climbed rung by rung. What had begun as disbelief was turning into a reckoning. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She revealed the findings of her own independent psychiatric evaluation conducted by a neutral third party, with no connection to David or his network. The results were irrefutable. Margaret showed no signs of dementia, psychosis, or mental illness. Her memory and reasoning skills were above average for her age. She has been imprisoned under false pretenses, Eleanor said firmly, and she was targeted because she knew too much. The judge looked over her glasses, silent for a long moment. Is the respondent present? She asked. David stood slowly, his face unreadable. You have a right to respond, Dr. Chen. He cleared his throat. My mother has always struggled. Since my father passed, I feared for her safety, for her well-being. The judge leaned forward. And did that justify forging medical records? Silencing witnesses? Or placing her under heavy medication without clear diagnosis? David blinked. Sir, the judge continued, her voice steely, I will be ordering a full investigation into your involvement and the institutions you coordinated with. At this time, I am overturning Margaret Chun's involuntary commitment. Effective immediately. Gasps filled the courtroom. Margaret closed her eyes. Not in disbelief, but in something deeper. Relief, yes, but also sorrow. Because this was never how she imagined winning. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled of distant rain and city smoke. Cars passed, pedestrians wandered, and the world indifferent and alive moved on. But Margaret stood still at the steps, her cardigan drawn close. The charm on her wrist warmed by sunlight. Maria stood beside her. Helen nearby. Thomas remained in the courtroom, answering press questions now spilling into the hallway. What now? Maria asked. Margaret breathed in deeply, her eyes on the sky. Now, we tell the rest of the story. That evening, back in Helen's guest room, Margaret watched the evening news play a story with her name on the banner. Elderly woman wrongfully committed uncovers medical fraud network. The anchors spoke of justice, resilience, and courage. She didn't feel brave. She felt like a woman who had survived something too enormous to fit into soundbites. But she also felt like herself again. Maria would testify further before the licensing board. Helen was already gathering victims' families to join a class action lawsuit. Eleanor confirmed the Department of Health had opened an official case against David and the affiliated clinics. It wasn't just about her anymore. And that, Margaret realized, was the only thing that made the pain worth it. That night she unpacked slowly. Not clothes, those could come later, but small things. The photo of Robert. A laminated drawing Emma had made years ago. The tin where she kept tea bags and mint candies. Then she sat by the window, watched the moon rise, and for the first time, in many months, felt completely unsupervised. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Margaret sat in a borrowed armchair beneath the lace-curtained window of Helen's guest room, holding a pen with a familiar weight. It was the same silver fountain pen Robert had given her the day she retired from teaching. Her fingers curled around it with practiced ease, but the letter before her remained unfinished. Dear Emma, she'd written. Then paused. There was so much to say. So much she wanted her granddaughter to know. Not just about what had happened, but about who Margaret had been before any of it. Not the woman described in David's forged charts. Not the dependent, or the burden, but the woman who raised a boy alone, who read bedtime stories in 3 languages, who once built a bookshelf from reclaimed lumber just to prove she could. She wanted Emma to know that silence had never been her nature, that she had once laughed so hard in church she'd nearly choked on a peppermint, that she had once stood at the foot of the Grand Canyon and yelled into the wind just to feel her voice echo back. She wanted Emma to remember her that way, not reduced or erased, but whole. Helen stepped in carrying 2 cups of tea. Still writing? Margaret nodded. Trying. Helen set a hand on her shoulder, then gave a quiet squeeze before leaving the room. Margaret returned to the page. She wrote slowly, each word its own kind of freedom. Double quotes. ... I hope someday you'll ask your father why he did what he did. I won't speak for him. I won't defend him. But I will say this. Even betrayal is built on a kind of desperation. And I pray you'll grow up with the courage to face truth instead of fear it. She paused again, brushing a drop of water from the page. Only it wasn't water. It was the first tear she'd allowed herself in days. Later that week, Maria visited with paperwork in hand. She was transferring to a different facility, one with independent oversight and community outreach programs. I'll still be working with seniors, she said, but not under people like him anymore. They sat outside on a weather-worn bench in Helen's backyard, sipping coffee in mismatched mugs. Margaret looked up at the grey-blue sky. There was a Christmas in the air, the first true breath of winter. You saved my life, she told Maria quietly. Maria shook her head. You did that yourself. I just opened a door you were already pushing on. By the end of the month, news of the scandal had spread beyond their state. Margaret's photo appeared in online news feeds, often the same portrait David once used for her prescription records. Now it accompanied articles with titles like Whistleblower, Grandma exposes fraud ring, and Senior citizen fights back against involuntary commitment abuse. Journalists called her courageous, but Margaret didn't feel brave. She felt hollow and tired and strangely free. She still didn't know what would happen to David. Charges were pending, investigations multiplying. She hadn't spoken to him since the courtroom. She wasn't sure if she ever would. Some pains don't need confrontation. Some don't even need closure. Some just need to be named and left behind. In December, she signed a lease. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom unit in a quiet corner of a senior living complex. But it had a view of the park and a small kitchen with enough space to knead dough if she ever decided to bake again. Helen cried when she helped carry boxes in. You're really doing this? I am, Margaret said. No one told her what pills to take. No one locked the doors at night. The mail had her name on it, not someone else's signature beneath hers. She placed the charm Emma had made for her above the entryway, right next to Robert's photo. He smiled from the wooden frame as if amused by the turn of events. She smiled back. Margaret started volunteering once a week at the library. It began small, just reading picture books aloud to toddlers during morning circle. But word spread, and soon a middle school teacher invited her to speak about resilience and memory. Then came the book club, then the legal advocacy group for wrongly institutionalized elders. She spoke softly but never hesitated. Her voice was no longer theirs to mute. One afternoon, as she walked through the community garden, her scarf tucked tight against the breeze, she found a girl of about 10 sitting alone on a bench, crying into her coat sleeve. Margaret hesitated, then gently sat beside her. They don't believe me, the girl whispered, as if no one ever had. Margaret nodded. That's how the worst kind of lies work. They make you question your own truth. The girl looked up. How do you stop that? Margaret reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a tissue. She handed it over. You remember, she said. Even when no one else does. Especially then. The girls sniffled and tucked the tissue away like treasure. They sat in silence, watching a robin hop across the frozen path. That evening, Margaret returned home and wrote a new letter. This one she didn't sign. She folded it carefully, tucked it into an envelope, and placed it on her bookshelf. A note for whoever came next. It read, You are not broken. They just couldn't benefit from your strength. But I see you. I believe you. Don't stop pushing the door open.